Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. My name is Richard Malik, and today you are joining an incredible panel, the Cyber CFO, CISO Accountability in the New Era of Software Supply Chain Security. First of all, these are your beautiful speakers. Myself, I am Richard Malik. I'm the head of product marketing over here at ReversingLabs. I am your MC. I am not your subject matter expert. I'm just the one that gets asked these two wonderful gentlemen to my proverbial left and right the great questions and keep this conversation going. Saša, please introduce yourself to this great crowd.
Sure. Thanks, Richard. So my name is Saša Zdjelar. I'm the Chief Trust Officer at ReversingLabs.
Excellent. Thanks, Saša. And Daniel Miessler, he is our special guest. Daniel, please say hello to these beautiful people.
Yeah, hello. Thanks for having me. So I'm the founder of a company called Unsupervised Learning. I've got about 24 years in security, and as of the end of 2022, I transitioned into AI and building products.
Well, that fun category of artificial intelligence. That's another webinar for us to take on in terms of conversation. Maybe that's our follow-up to this one. But we're going to go in and get started with the precipice of the conversation. What has really started this whole conversation, Saša, between you and your networks and internally. This is from Reuters. The U.S. SEC, Security Exchange Commission, sues SolarWinds for concealing cyber risk before massive hacking. This happened recently in terms of the lawsuit, but we're, almost 4 years post SolarWinds breach, and that ripple effect is still being felt today. Now, Saša, Daniel, the big question I want to start off this whole conversation with is, what is the new impact of CISO liability based off what we're seeing in the SEC that we didn't have to worry about pre-SolarWinds attack? Saša, I'll start with you.
Sure, sure, thanks. And I'll, I say before I even answer, I want to throw so much credit to Daniel on this topic and in general on thought leadership in this space. And I think as we have this discussion, it's going to be evident why I said that. Daniel and I have known each other now for, actually, I don't know, what is it, Daniel? Probably 15 years, something like that, 14,
something
15,
like that, yeah.
like that. And, one thing that never fails is if you have a conversation with Daniel is he's very likely, telling you stuff that's going to happen many years in the future. And I remember, I don't know, probably 2016, 17 timeframe, we were having this discussion. He ultimately turned it into this fantastic, now very prophetic, blog post that basically said, our entire domain is, started in, I don't know, pick a decade, something like the 70s. And it was these like magic dark arts and no one quite knew what was going on. And people were, sending dial tones into the phone to make freak phone calls and hacking their way through life. And then it evolved over decades into, more and more of a practice that's mainstream. Maybe now it's being taught in school. Now you have people who are security leaders, in the industry. And, he made this amazing chart, like now 8 years ago, I think, something like that said how it was going to progress from being like these, squirrely, magical dark arts that no one quite understands into eventually, this thing that becomes, and I think you called it something like boring, like accounting, meaning methodical, mature domain, taught in leading institutions, something that is, done at a very senior level in corporations. And the timing that you put on that move from, InfoSec to, the transition into boring was, you said 2020s, kind of as a broad decade, which again, as usual, you've nailed it, because this exact conversation that we're having, or as Richard said, kind of the culmination of why we're having this conversation happened in the 2020s. So what actually happened? It was splashed there on the screen. To me, it was a very, very pivotal moment in the industry. And as you and I were discussing maybe 4 or 5 months ago, which also led to another great blog post from you about on this topic, was we both kind of said, and I think some of this was informed by, the 20 years I spent in oil and gas, because some of that was very, very relevant to us. We saw it happening across the street when, folks walked out with all their belongings in a box, which is when Enron happened, right? Enron had this incredible moment when, due to what were later confirmed to be, mark-to-market accounting and all sorts of kind of not all on the up and up accounting practices, that company lost everything. And the people who invested a lot with them lost everything. Its enterprise value disappeared overnight. And as a result of that, post Enron, we had the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, right? We had all these new practices come for CFOs that said, you now must act this way. This is what's going to keep the investors whole. This is what's going to keep, employees and their stock programs and their retirement plans whole. You must now start acting this way if you are a CFO. And again, it brought this discipline and boring, right, methodical approach to the financial discipline. And so what you and I were discussing some months ago that led to your original blog post was, was SolarWinds, was that the cybersecurity or domains Enron moment? And I think it was. I think we will look back on everything that's happening in our industry and we will say, kind of like BC and AD, I think we will say there are those things that used to happen in cyber and with CISOs prior to SolarWinds. And then there's an entire new set of behaviors and expectations post SolarWinds. And I think that's what we're hoping to dive into today. What are your thoughts on?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And one thing that's interesting is it's not actually, the BC and AD is actually not the incident. It's actually the government's response to the incident.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's also, for those who don't know, that's a great call out that, the SEC action and the Wells notice and all of their public commentary about it since, they've tried to be pretty clear to say, look, yes, this company had a breach, but that's not what this is about. This is not about the breach. This is about what was found after the breach and what was disclosed about the breach and what was subsequently said about the program, right? And the program's controls and how robust they were, what was asserted versus what was in the SEC's view later asserted. Now, to be, very, very, let's say appropriate here. All of these at this point are accusations, right? We don't know that this has not been adjudicated yet. We don't know how this is going to end up, but right now this is simply an accusation of something. And, I've had the, privilege of speaking with both, Tim Brown there, who is the CISO, and a number of other CISOs that are in similar situations, and they really do talk about this as being, quite the kind of seminal moment for them as a domain, and how they have to act, what their personal liability is, how they think about employment, where they want to take a job, where they don't, what kind of contract language and, considerations you might need to have before going into a role to assure that you're going to have certain, legal fees paid for should something come up. It's a kind of an entirely new world.
Right. There's something I would like to know, just for our audience that does not know. Post SolarWinds, the post SolarWinds breach, SolarWinds did actually become a ReversingLabs customer. I just feel that's proper disclosure there. So we are actually part of their system. So while we are discussing the situation that they are going through in terms of the impact of the breach and the subsequent ripple effect of it, we are still respectful of the fact that they are customers. So I would like to know that. Now, Daniel, over to that side, you're the Nostradamus apparently of the cybersecurity industry, which I think is very relevant to your background right now. It's very future thinking. What is this impact that we're going to see from this post SEC action, no matter the outcome? Like, what are you seeing coming down the line?
I think a lot of it is what Saša has talked about. It's going to require CISOs to think about what type of CISO they want to be. A lot of people got into the game believing it was largely technical and largely about hacking and, building a security program and keeping the bad people out. But increasingly, as the industry matures, it's becoming, like Saša said, a lot more like accounting. It's becoming a lot more like being a CFO and watching the books and making sure there are not discrepancies in the book somewhere, and being very, very careful about claims that you make. And some people are going to be like, okay, yeah, that's maturity. That's the future of the industry. So that's what I'm going to become. And other people are going to be like, you know what, that's not what I signed up for. And I'm happy to have someone come in above me. And so I can still continue to do the technical side.
Right. Just staying on that thing for a second, Daniel. It's interesting, again, when you and I first met and how many people we've both met who, come up through some sort of a hacking background or, I used to be the network admin or the firewall admin. Now I'm the CISO because, that's the role I was put into. So it's common for people to come from quite technical backgrounds and eventually kind of make their way into the CISO role. And for many of them, this concept of having to, step further into the business side is just off-putting. It's just not what they want.
Yes.
So the question now is, in some ways, this is a moment for the CISOs to cease. Now they can, to your point, they can say, look, sounds like an entirely different type of person is needed, to be accountable for this. I'm going to step down or step sideways for someone else to take that. But it's also an opportunity for those CISOs that can and believe they want to step into those roles or maybe stretch themselves a bit more on the business side. It is an opportunity to probably take on a more senior role. We're seeing now these roles the trajectory is only upward from a seniority perspective, right? Some are even becoming Section 16 officers of their company. That's a very big deal. More and more of them are starting to have D&O coverage. It's still not super common, but it's starting to happen more and more. So like the trajectory is clearly in a certain direction. But the point is, if a current CISO is not willing to step into their role, or like we've discussed, if being the cyber CFO is not their thing, then neither is being the most senior, security person in the company. And they'll happily put someone above you who will.
Yeah.
You hit on this, the cyber CFO. This is the new term that we're coining for this because of that mixture of both technological balance, but also business acumen that is required as we're seeing the impact and the ripples of the SEC and the growing trend of attacks against businesses. What is, beyond the impact of being more business related, having, thinking more like as an accountant, what is the impact of being a cyber CFO? What is it?
Saša?
Oh,
Yeah. Well, I would say the first thing that I would say, my first comment is going to sound maybe tongue in cheek, but I would say the era of just dropping the word ROI and, assuming that it comes across like you're very businessy, that's over. The modern CISO, I know we're saying we're coining the term cyber CFO. I don't want people to have the takeaway that ReversingLabs is suggesting that a new role that will actually exist will be cyber CFO. We're not suggesting that. What we're suggesting is that the role will become more akin to a cyber-like variant of a CFO. So what does that mean? It means that the person, for example, what did this used to look like a couple of years ago? You come into a role, and let's say it's Daniel in this case, and you're like, look, Daniel, we're just so happy that you've joined us as our new CISO. We're thrilled you're here. So just for a little bit of background, the reason that Susie, Johnny, Bobby, Freddie, and Mark didn't work out is because they were the org of no. They were the org of no. And the reason that we hired you, Daniel, is because we just know that you are going to find a way to yes and really help us grow this business and thrive. So we're just really happy that you're on board here, Daniel, and can't wait to partner with your organization and, grow this business and find a way to yes. That is a very common intro for a CISO when they come in, to make it very clear what has not worked well in the past and what they are now here to help, which is, please start rubber stamping these things faster. You're holding up my business.
Yes.
The implications of resisting in the past have been largely that, like Bobby, Susie, Johnny, Freddie, and Mark before, you're shown the door and they look for the next person that might be more agreeable. But there hasn't been this, personal liability, go to jail kind of potential. The potential was you might not be a fit for the company. And so what would CISOs usually do? They would come into the role and they would spend the first few weeks learning the environment and say, look, I'm just here to learn from you guys. Everyone here is so smart. I'm just here to enable the business and, help where I can and develop great relationships with engineering and, with the product organization. And look, along the way, if there are some things that I can nudge in the right direction, that would be great. But I'm not here to ruffle feathers. I'm not here to cause friction. Meanwhile, what you are sending every month in your rep letter to the board continues to be things like, we have world-class controls against nation-state adversaries. We're super NIST this, and we're, super whatever that, and we have the best controls. And meanwhile, the CISO is just saying, okay, My personal observation is that that's not exactly what we have, but I also can't be perceived as the person to wipe all that out and say, wow, that's all, BS. We don't have any of those things. So I'm going to slowly make some changes, kind of gracefully, things that are not causing friction. And over time, I'll nudge things in the right direction. That's how it used to work. Today, if a CISO comes in, the minute they are in the seat, whatever is being said about the security program upline to the board and the 10K and others is on their watch. If anything is misrepresented, they allowed it to happen. Just like a CFO, when they first come in and a CFO starts learning about, little bit of fraud over here and a little bit of unbalanced books over there, there is no we're going to let this go for a few quarters and over time introduce a little bit less fraud. They don't.
Yeah, we don't want to ruffle feathers.
Yeah, we don't want to ruffle feathers. So we're going to, keep a little bit of this fraud in place. That's not how they operate, right? They have to immediately kind of whistle blow and throw up red flags and say, okay, I'm finding these things, because in the post Sarbanes-Oxley world, that's what's expected of them. Otherwise, they also go to jail and are held personally accountable. That's the change that's coming. Is CISOs have no longer the opportunity to kind of, I would say, play nice. Now playing nice means they're putting themselves in personal liability. But the expectations have still not changed, right? People will still be looking at their org and saying, okay, but you guys slow us down and can we find a path to yes? Well, again, it's going to be a different mindset and a different set of decisions for the CISOs now that they have all this new personal accountability. Sorry, that was a long answer. Daniel, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And it's not just for the CISO to make that change, but the whole org has to see the CISO in a different way. Because going back to your point about expecting the CISO not to ruffle feathers, I mean, that starts way back in the interview process. I mean, you're filtering for somebody who's going to be a team player. And it is absolute career suicide, I think, to come in and disagree with what your team has been saying this whole time. You walk in the door, the team has been saying for 2 years, we have all these strong controls. You can't come in and say, no, we don't. I mean, you're going against the team. You're not a team player. I mean, they're going to start moving you out very quickly. And it's the whole org that's going to move you out for not being a team player. It's all your peers. It's everyone in the org is basically going to say this person is not a culture fit. And no one's asking a CFO about a culture fit. It's like you have to do the finances first and they have to add up perfectly and your statements have to match the books. And that is a massive cultural shift that's going to happen throughout the entire org and the entire industry, not just with individual CISOs.
There's a phrase that we are circling right now, and I want to bring us back into this. And I think it's going to encompass both the internal impact of a CISO joining an organization, as well as what they have to do. So when a new CISO joins an organization, they are expected to trust the foundation they are walking on. Trust us. We've done all the work. You're just here to be the leader of this group. Then to take this back to the SolarWinds side and the impact of software supply chain attacks, software vendors are telling their customers, trust us. This software is secure. You don't need to worry about it. But we have recently seen a report come from Gartner. By the way, we will share this report with everyone here. Dale Gardner, not related to Gartner, Dale Gardner wrote a report essentially saying, if an organization refuses to provide an SBOM as part of the purchasing process, that should be a negating factor in your decision to buy that software. Now, that was a paraphrase of what he said, but he's saying no SBOM, don't give them your money, because you can't trust everything they're just saying. Just as a CISO can't come in and trust the foundation or the organization has done everything right leading up to their joining of the organization. Daniel, I wanted to ask this over to you to kick off on that. What are your thoughts on that?
I think we're going to see a lot more of that. I think we're going to see far more of that, because it really just plays to, like you said, trust. Trust requires transparency, right? Mm-hmm. You've got to be able to see what you're actually, siding with and backing when you make a purchase. So I see that and a whole lot more being sort of required. There'll be some sort of framework that says you have to show us all these different things It actually gets back to a very old debate from when I first got into security. It's like, who has liability for bad software, right? And traditionally, it's not been with the vendor. It's been, with the buyer. It's up to
Right.
them to somehow filter and decide if it's a good package or not. Of course, they're not capable of doing that. And I think the further along this gets, the more of it is going to move towards the vendor, pushed by probably government.
Well,
There's
look, I mean, just this past week, we saw CISA release a statement saying, even if you bought software from another vendor, which, we're all software consumers ultimately, and then some of us are also software producers. Even if it's someone else's software, you're still liable for the security outcomes that software brings to your environment. And why do they do that? I suspect the strong reason was they need the buyer side to exert its influence, right? They want the liability felt by the CISO as the buyer to go back to their vendor and say, listen, I'm not assuming your liability, and I need insights that the thing that I'm buying is that I can trust it. How do I know that it doesn't have malware? How do I know that it hasn't been tampered with? How do I know it doesn't have embedded secrets and network beaconing to places it shouldn't? And, is cryptographically sound and all kinds of other things that, look, I was a buyer for 20 years, a large Fortune 10 buyer. And I think I had 3 of everything you could buy, at RSA or Black Hat or whatever, in AppSec. And I think back on all the investments that I made, whether it was SAST or DAST or SCA tools or whatever, and not one of them would have done anything for the types of breaches that we've seen in the last few years. If you think back on, Circle CI, Kaseya, MoveIt, 3CX, SolarWinds, like the list goes on and on. Those are all commercial packages. Like I can't SAST Zoom.exe. I can't DAST SAP GUI.exe. I can't SCA, Windows 11 9 gig ISO. Like I can't do anything with my traditional AppSec tools to comprehend these risks. So for me, as if I'm a CISO, this is a giant blind spot for the software that I'm acquiring from others. Yet I'm still liable for it. So this is, I think, why Dale made this very, very astute observation.
Yeah.
That it's the tools that we've been using in AppSec for the last 15 years are just not up for the current moment. They're just inadequate for the challenges that we face today.
I think there's another phrase. Saša, you coined the term. There's a reason they crash the whole car when it comes to software supply chain security and analysis. But there's another idea and then another analogy that we can tie into that. When that car fails or a component of that car fails, even 3 years later, it is not on the buyer of the car to take responsibility for the failure of the part. It is on the manufacturer to address it. Same with a lot of the consumer products. And so it's almost as if software has been able to ride free and clear of this whole responsible disclosure, responsibility act in order to, but now they're being asked to, hey, you got to keep up and catch up to the rest of the industry because you're the only one not being held liable for the impact of the costly breaches, businesses shutting down, losing their data. I mean, we've seen it, all of us have been in this industry for decades. We've seen organizations literally lose their business because of a hack. And that is a big concern. So I think this is definitely a shift in that space.
Yeah. One thing I can say about that, this is not a direct analog here at all, but one thing I find interesting is like what the banking industry did about this. So when fraud started happening, people started freaking out. And the way the banks handled it is they said, you know what? Any fraud, we just absorb. Like we give you the money back, right? So you can't quite do that in the software industry. But the point is when pressure builds, the acceptance of risk has to go somewhere, right? In the case of banking, it went to the banks. They said, I'll absorb that because they had to keep the friction reduced so that people would keep purchasing. So in this case, the pressure is building because of these supply chain attacks. So the question is, who's going to absorb that risk acceptance?
So right now it's a lot of pressure is being put on the CISO. And if I'm following along, because this is a different direction than we planned, I'm following along, what we are alluding to is the CISO is going to turn around and start putting pressure on the manufacturers, the software producers, and say, we are not going to buy your software. Saša, from your days being a buyer for a Fortune 50, Fortune 500 organization, with this new target on the back of a CISO, proverbial target, let's not be hyperbolic, proverbial target on the back of a CISO, you would have a lot more caution to purchasing software, which is going to slow down sales processes, impact the purchasing and the financials of an organization that's trying to sell software, renewal fees, and everything else. That's the natural progression of the CISO position. But there's also the concern about, what about the CISOs that don't want to be in that position? What do? We've got thousands upon thousands of CISOs that came up under the old premise of what a CISO is. Now they're being asked to do so much more. Where did they go if they're like, I don't want that responsibility?
Yeah, it's unfortunately not even theory. Like, we're actually seeing it in practice. There are, I know several actually Fortune 100 CISOs that have recently left their post. You can go look for recent LinkedIn announcements of, new jobs that they're now in, where, I've reached out to them and talked to them, and they've left a job specifically because they were uncomfortable with the level of personal liability that they had in their, previous company, what they were being asked to kind of sign and attest to. They just weren't comfortable that was realistic, and they thought, they would eventually be in the crosshairs of some type of an investigation or similar to a Wells notice. So they have left their, public company job, and they've taken either a similar role in the private sector, so in other words, where the SEC doesn't have exactly the same reach, or the same regulations don't apply, although I would just say don't apply yet. That's coming as well. Or they've left the CISO role entirely, and they've looked for, advisory opportunities in private equity in the VC world, right? Many of them are going on and bringing their multi-decades of operator experience to advise portfolios of companies, for example. That's becoming a more and more common destination for a lot of former CISOs.
Yeah, Daniel, what about your perspective on that?
Yeah, I think that's definitely one option, is they just get out of the light altogether. Another option is for them just to kind of move down, so they become like the technical. It's almost like becoming kind of like a security director, whereas the actual officer would be like a risk officer, or some other senior, more businessy type person, and they would just like notch down, I would say, a little bit in terms of responsibility. So they wouldn't be in those crosshairs, and they would be like the technical executor of the program.
Right. And what about those that do want it? What are their steps? Like, the CISO's coming up, they're like, yes, I want that. I want to be the one that enforces that control. I want to be the bad guy, no longer the yes man. What's your take on that? What's the advice there?
Well, it's like Saša said earlier, you got to learn more about the business than a few keywords like ROI. You've really got to immerse yourself in the business, and fully understand it. And I'm a little bit skeptical that a lot of people are going to be able to make that transition, because it is such a major shift. What are your thoughts, Saša?
Well, an environment that you and I are both familiar with is probably the most mature organization I've seen in this space. They would never bring in a CISO from the outside. It's just not their thing. They would say, look, in order for you to represent our risk at the most senior level, you need to know our risk. You need to have run a P&L here. You need to have been immersed in multiple business lines. And then eventually we will give you hand over the keys to running the risk management function of a large corporation. So I think one is going to be, they're going to have to your point, kind of be more immersed in the business. Now, it's maybe unrealistic that every company will organically grow from within, a 35-year veteran to be a CISO. But what we might start seeing more is when they come into the role, like in earnest attempts to do, immersion or work shadowing or some critical functions. They might go spend, 8 weeks working at a different location and working, side by side with the finance function or the engineering function, or something that gives them much more real insights into the business and how it operates and its compliance and regulatory climate and its challenges, much more so than, well, quarterly we have a meeting and I kind of get an update on what they're doing over there. That's not learning or knowing the business. So I think that's one thing, is just we will see a broadening of the skill set to include far more business discipline. I mean, this is probably going to sound horrible to people, some people here listening, but I think you'll probably have a lot more MBA types moving into these roles, people that have a much more rooted in core business kind of acumen type of background. They will understand how to read a balance sheet. They will know how to, what a P&L looks like. They will have run a business or understand how one runs. I mean, those are just going to have to become core skill sets for the vast majority of senior CISOs in the future.
Right.
The last thing I would add is simply they will think differently about their blind spots. Today, one of their blind spots entirely is software supply chain, right? Right now, it's a combination of a little bit of contract language, prayer, and faith that the vendor is good. That's pretty much all you have today for software supply chain. You don't have anything else. And in the past, maybe you slept okay as a CISO with those three controls. We'll call those three controls. I don't think that's going to be the case in the future. So you need some capability for whatever you're about to bring into your environment and run your business on, which is probably hundreds, if not thousands, of third-party vendors. What's in it? What's the ingredient list for this software? Is it bad? What attestations can they give me? Much more so than in the past.
It's not just about the SBOM though, and it's something that we've talked about here at ReversingLabs quite a bit. It's going beyond the SBOM. It's the idea that the SBOM, one, you need a cohesive and comprehensive analysis, and Dale Gardner said this also in his report, of commercial, proprietary, and third-party code. So Saša, back to your background, your SaaS, SCA, DAS tools, they're not going to do that. They're going to be looking at open source, which leaves proprietary, commercial, and all the artifacts completely unscanned. That impacts your larger attack surface. But on top of that, it's the what to do with that SBOM, right? You have the SBOM. How does it apply to a security? What are the security ramifications? What's the actionable intake on that one? But we're also talking a lot on the software development lifecycle side, those tools. On the vendor application side of tools, those tools are even less, I would say, invasive. You've got surveys, pen testing, sandboxing, and then finally, we're hoping your post-execute or post-deployment endpoint security product is going to detect it once you've deployed that software out there. In the likes of 3CX, it wasn't until it was installed on 60,000 endpoints until it was actually picked up and stopped. So there's remediation costs and all that come out there. So what we're saying is that there's definitely a gap where the CISO needs to come in pre-deployment, pre-purchase, and say, we need this analysis. We need to understand everything that's coming in. And I'm not going to say yes until I see that ingredients list and know what impact this is going to have on my attack surface.
Yeah,
any thoughts on that one, Dan? Oh, go ahead, Saša.
Sorry, just a quick comment on SBOM, because you said something I think very important for our listeners today. An SBOM is most analogous to an ingredient list like you would see at a grocery store, right? You go to the grocery store, you pick a box of Cheerios or whatever it is off the shelf, and you say, I wonder what's in this. And on the surface, it sounds like that's very useful. Well, maybe. The challenge is, unless you are, a food chemist or food rocket surgeon or whatever the right phrase is, the ingredient list on a nutritional label, this is a little bit of a tangent, but it's important here, is required to list things in order of greatest to smallest. So the thing that makes up the greatest portion has to be listed first, followed by the next biggest, etc. The reason that's important is, what usually happens is you look at an ingredient list and the first 2 or 3, maybe 4 ingredients are things you recognize. So you look at a label and it says, yeah, vegetable oil, okay, soy, all right, I don't know, cane sugar, corn, yeah. Okay, and then like ingredient 4 is like tetrachlorobenzenate. You're like, what? That's a thing? That sounds like it blows up. And then the next one is even longer, and the next one is even less pronounceable, and the rest of the ingredients are all unpronounceable. And this goes back to the old, if it wasn't in your grandma's pantry, you shouldn't eat it. Go look at some ingredient list at some point. The first 2 or 3 things you can recognize, the rest of them you can't even pronounce, let alone understand what you're putting in your body. Why am I bringing up this analogy? The same thing applies in software. So having an SBOM, super important. And I would argue we generate the most comprehensive SBOM because we can handle, again, things others can't, like huge file sizes, commercial packages. things way beyond just open source. Having said that, having just a list is probably not the most useful thing, because again, unless you are a software rocket surgeon, you're going to go down that list pretty quickly, and an ingredient 2 or 3 or component 2, 3, or 4, you're going to start looking at things that you have no clue about. They're just not going to make any sense. So the list is important for transparency, and later you might want to go back and see where all your, log 7z's are, whatever the future attack's going to be. But more important than the list, and you alluded to this, Richard, is knowing the context of each item. Is each component, does it have malware? Has it been tampered with? What's in it? That's the important part. It's the context around each ingredient, not just the list of them, which is obviously something we provide.
Right. And I'm trying not to be too pitchy, but I do appreciate that subtle inclusion there, Saša. There's something that came up in the conversation. We hit on, for those that the CISOs, I'm going to go back to the cyber CFO, the CISO's new role. We talked about those who want it, who are pursuing that job. For those that don't want it, and what's next for them. And so what about those that want to push for it within their organization? The up and comers, like sitting there going, I'm a security researcher, or I'm a CISO right now, and we need to put these in. Who do they need to get for buy-in? What steps do they need to take in terms of setting their organization up to take the step into this advanced CISO position? Daniel, I want to toss it over to you, kind of get your thoughts first on that.
Yeah, unfortunately, I have a little bit of a pessimistic view on this. I actually think that things happen in security when they're forced to happen. I don't think that change really comes from internal within security programs to bring about the big things. For example, all this cyber CFO stuff, which I think is just an amazing term that Saša came up with, because it instantly tells you it's a very different game than a CISO. All those things, like, they are fundamentally different, right? Anything that is CFO oriented, it's so obvious from the label that it's different from CISO, that I think once you see it, you either know that you want to go into it or you don't.
That's an interesting, I mean, you're not wrong. A lot of the change, we've seen in endpoint security from ransomware, from network security, because of the failure of firewalls, the VPNs no longer being entrusted because of compromise on their side. We've seen change only come out of the negative. I want to be a little bit more optimistic and hope that there's someone that's going to push for an internal growth. Maybe they see what's going on around them and say, oh crap, we need to make some changes.
The problem there is that people can know it and see it. Their managers will also know it and see it. But if it's not the time for the industry, it's just not the time for the industry. So if somebody internally, in fact, even the CISO says to the business, you know what, we need to take, our responsibilities a lot more serious. We need to act like CFOs instead of like CISOs. They're going to be like, who are you and what are you saying? If the government says, hey, you need to start acting like CFOs, then suddenly the whole culture changes. So it's like, security, unfortunately, is just very reactive, I think, and especially for these very large culture shifts.
Yeah. Well, I mean, think about another one. In a recent blog post we put out, I listed this as one of the kind of items that I think will be coming in mass for CISOs. So we haven't talked about it today, is, and again, I've seen this in practice at, a company I previously worked at for 100% of the company, not a handful of select, executives, but the entire company was careful drafting training. And it's training that every year reminds you that, everything you say and everywhere you say it will one day only be used against you, not for you in court. Be very careful with when you say things like, well, man, when this product comes to market, we're going to just really destroy our competition. Okay, that might sound great in a rah-rah moment, for a company that's very excited about a product launch. Those are words that I promise you, someone will one day in court be like, see, these, antitrust and anti-competitive practices that we accuse them of having, look at these statements internally. They are clearly out to destroy their competition and not have any. Like, every word you say will be used against you, not for you. So think very carefully about what you say in what context. Is it fact or is it very hyperbolic, opinion-based, and what the implication of a lot of opinion might mean for your company from a liability perspective? Where do you write those things down? What's discoverable? All those things I think are practices coming for much smaller I mean, that has existed for a long time for mega corporations, but I think now this stuff is kind of trickling down and becoming a mainstay of much, much smaller companies.
That's a really good point. I actually have something to add on there. I think if you look at the current sort of style of internal security orgs, you have the org itself sees all the real problems, and they're reporting these problems constantly. And a lot of times they're more junior people, they're very technical people, and they will say things in emails in Slack like, we're going to get hacked. This is how we're going to get owned. This is the absolute worst I've ever seen. I can't believe we work here. This is so embarrassing. And this kind of moves up the levels. And again, the CISO might see it, but they're also at the same time doing a board presentation talking about how awesome things are. And so it's like those two worlds are separated. But in this world of like increased transparency, yeah, all those Slack conversations are going to get pulled up and then shown to the CISO. Look, you saw these conversations. You knew this was happening. You knew people were saying this was, a dumpster fire, but you're still over here claiming these other things. So maybe one of those changes is that, like Saša said, people are just taught to be very, very careful with what they say, not just in a formal report, but in a Slack conversation.
I think there's a fundamental we can go back to in terms of we teach our children about social media, and if you put it on social media, even if you think it's deleted, it's there forever. There's a record, there's something, and that same can be said about everything we do. Our digital footprint and fingerprints are everywhere. We have to remember that Slack and emails are, just because we think they're private and we are having that private conversation, they can still be recorded. I've been in this industry long enough. I don't even trust all of the so-called secure communication tools, Signal, WhatsApp, others, because in the end, there's still a digital record of something happening. Increase in, hey, you started talking a lot more with this person around this time when this hack was happening. What were you talking about? You have to answer that under oath. There are definitely records on there, but that's the fundamental idea, is that what you say can still be used against you and your organization, which puts your organization.
Well, and I would take it a step further to say, not just what you say, but what someone else says about your environment. So I'll give you a specific example. Again, this used to be only common at the largest mega corporations. Now, I would say probably 50-60% of the CISOs that I talk to are using this practice as well as at much smaller companies. So think about how many, probably including our attendees today, how many constantly are commissioning some type of benchmarking study or maturity assessment or some kind of broad scale pen test or whatever it might be, to see how their program is doing. Right. And, I've unfortunately paid for many of these myself in many years in the past. So I know how they go, and they're generally pre-written, right? Like, you don't need to see an environment. Once you know that environment, everyone has a local admin and, domain admin still being slung around everywhere in hashes. Like, you can pre-write, well, you should have better privileged access management. And in every environment, a completely safe comment for every consultant to make is you should be better at patching. Every environment is in a perpetual state of always could be better at patching. But think about this. And an organization comes in, they do a maturity assessment or something, they look at your environment and they're like, their key findings are things like, should improve patching. 3 months later, you're popped through whatever, SQL injection or something, in your DMZ. Why? Because, 3 SQL boxes were not patched. That is, whether that is egregious and, gross negligence is about to be adjudicated by a jury of your peers, which means, a plumber, a high school teacher, a bus driver, an accountant, and, an attorney are about to decide if an unpacked SQL box for 30 days is gross negligence or not. And you're not going to do well in that situation. So what I've seen more and more CISOs do very, very smartly is they're now starting to do what megacorps used to do a long time ago, which is they have third-party retained, legal representation. That third-party law firm is the one that commissions the benchmark or the maturity assessment, so that the findings come back and are under attorney-client privilege, and they're not subject to discovery one day as part of litigation, or much, much harder to get to, so that the document you paid for to assess your own maturity, it won't be used against you again in court. Like, these are some of the steps that were already starting to happen in the CISO communities that will be much further amplified in this new kind of personal liability era.
So the personal responsibility is huge on that one. I want to end with this question to the two of you. 5 minutes to answer this question, and we want to open up. There's a really good comment in here that I want to get to, and some fun little questions for us to ask to take us back to our basic roots. The CISO just got a target on their back. What's next? Daniel, over to you.
Let's see. I think the number one thing is what we were talking about earlier. They have to decide if that is the type of scrutiny that they want to be in the business of absorbing. And I think the vast majority of current CISOs are probably going to say no. I think it's going to take a different pedigree, a different career arc type of person who's going to want to live in that world. And I think you have to kind of grow up in the industry knowing that you're going to live in that world. So I think the number one thing is you got to decide if CFO is really the game that you want to play. It's going to be a cyber CFO, it's going to be a risk CFO, but it's still going to be a CFO ultimately, or a risk officer, as opposed to a hacker who is now very senior. So I think that's the biggest one.
Great. Saša, your thoughts. What's next for the CISO that just got a target on their back?
Yeah, I would say beyond what Daniel said, it's to reach out to your network. I think it's to very quickly learn from others. There are now, unfortunately, folks that have been dragged through this a few times. They know what it's like. There's folks that have come in, post breach. There are folks that have been part of companies that have had, Wells notices or have been personally sued. I think, first step would be to get a lot of very sound advice from people that might have, already had to deal with something like that.
Great. All right, let's pass it over to this comment. Megan Martin said, medical device part of the world here. We're seeing a lot of cloud-based devices plus use of COTS services. FDA is asking for evidence of agreements with vendors, suppliers, service providers that defines who is responsible for which part of the cybersecurity and how it's going to be maintained. I love that. Historically, we've had trouble getting that from vendor service provider. I think that's going to have to change. Megan, I actually want to comment on this one because my first job out of college was for a large pharmaceutical device company on the product marketing side. And something I learned was that the device that they were selling, I'm not going to call them, not name and shame them, but the device that they were selling every single year with a new version was just a new plastic skin over technology that had not been code technology that had not been updated in 15 years, meaning that there was code rot. Now, this was 20 years ago, and this organization is apparently the leader of this supposed this space that they cover. That was where I was first introduced to this idea that we were selling something just with fancy new box instead of actually new technology. And the product marketing team would have to come in and fluff up the language. So there is a little bit of distrust on that side. And I can imagine now with all the interconnected devices you're running into and the new softwares that are being required for reporting, for healthcare disclosures, everything else like that, that there is a lot more transparency needed. But I want to pass it over to the actual experts in the room. Saša, you definitely have something to say on this one.
Well, yeah, I would just say that, first of all, fantastic observation. I think the challenge that you're having to deal with in the medical industry is, unfortunately or not, you guys are in some ways charting a path for the rest of the lesser regulated industries, right? Credit to the FDA for coming out with, for example, medical device, requirements, security requirements, and requirements for SBOMs there. Like, that was actually, the first one that had any teeth, because everything else in the US for now is, I would say kind of held together with shoestring and bubblegum, right? It's an executive order that, it's great that we have something, but executive orders come and go with kind of political winds that may, shift this coming year. And who knows what might happen with that. Although in fairness, it's looking like it's being adopted by organizations and agencies, even with the risk that it might go away, because I think people are starting to realize this is just the right thing to do. But it's still, from an actual legislative or statutory perspective, for now in the US, still pretty weak. But that's not the case in all areas. So FDA did this thing for medical devices. I thought it was very smart conceptually to do. And so you guys are in some ways charting a path for the rest of the verticals to follow. I know it's difficult at the moment, and to your point, very hard to comply with some of these. But in other areas of the world, right, they've codified far more of this on the books. In Europe, we have something called ECRA, the European Cyber Resilience Act. That's moving through EU Parliament and is about to become the law of the land in June of this year. That will require every piece of software sold in the EU territory, every piece of software to be independently verified by labs, certified labs, that the software meets certain kind of criteria. Something like that is probably what we need, in the US as well. And eventually we'll have it. We don't have it yet, but I completely feel your current struggle with who's responsible for the liability. And like Daniel was mentioning earlier, the software industry has kind of gotten a pass for a long time. It is the only industry where the manufacturer can knowingly make a defective product and sell it to the buyer, and the buyer assumes all the risk. And that paradigm is changing, albeit very, very slowly. Pardon.
Yeah, I find the question really interesting. What it reminds me and actually gives me a thought is that I think a big part of this cyber CFO thing is actually going to have a specific game to it, a very major component to the job, which I just thought of being liability discovery and distribution. Because your question was like, okay, who's responsible? I think that might be the first thing that this new cyber CFO has to do, is figure out where all the risk is and who owns it, and like handing it out and distributing it and making sure that on paper it's actually formally distributed to the right places.
Right.
So that when something bad happens, it's not everyone like pointing at each other trying to figure out who's actually responsible.
Right. I appreciate both of your insights on that one. So I do want to open up to some more questions, but because we are all security nerds, there's some fun questions in here. Not necessarily relevant to the software supply chain security side, but I'd like to ask anyways. Do I need to separate antivirus, anti-cybercrime applications in Windows 11?
If I'm reading into this question correctly, I think it's saying, if I'm running Windows 11, do I need a standalone or separate antivirus? Yeah, I don't think I'm in a position to answer that. I think that's a company by company decision. It might come with one natively, right? That one that it comes natively with might be good enough for your risk tolerance. There's also some variation in what level, are you E3, 5? Like there's all kinds of additional complexity to that. So I would simply say there's not a one size fits all answer to that question, but it is the right question to ask.
That is the right question. That is the most politically correct answer Saša has ever given in his career. Ladies and gentlemen, we were all here for it. Yeah. Daniel,
those who know me well actually know I have a very strong opinion on that answer, but not in this forum.
Hey, endpoint security is my background. No, I have an opinion on that as well. But Daniel, I want to toss this one over to you. Why is the data of so many people leaked in big telecom companies, and how can they avoid it? And we do have a relevant question after that.
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure why telecom companies seem to get hit so hard. What I can't tell is whether or not it's a reporting focus, so they keep finding the stories and amplifying them, or if it's actually a higher incidence. I think it could just be the size and scale of the org and the fact that they have so many customers and so many business units within them, but I'm actually not sure about that.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. All right, let's bring it back into the conversation. Rick just asked, with more accountability and liability come to CISOs, what now are most important roles on a CISO security teams to support them? I love this question. Saša, to you.
Yeah, well, first of all, a quick hi and shout out to a high school friend, Rick, who asked the question. So hey, Rick, good to see you again. So I love the question. I would also say the answer might be a little bit unconventional. So I would say most security teams are resourced and staffed in a relatively traditional manner of, I have a SOC leader and I have a, this leader and I have an AppSec person. If I think about where I have the greatest blind spot as a CISO, again, in this new paradigm, that's what we're hyper focused on, is what is actually the delta since SolarWinds? What's the new stuff I should be focused on that I haven't necessarily been focused on in the past? I would say it's two areas that might not sound sexy on the surface, but they probably will be some of the most important, which is how good or strong is your GRC leader? That's an area that I think has been kind of underserved in cybersecurity. It's kind of looked at as the old school discipline, governance, risk, compliance. I would say you have to have a really, really strong GRC leader, and GRC in general is making a comeback in tooling and investments in startups. More and more companies are coming out with GRC solutions because it's needed in an environment where we have massive, constant regulatory and compliance change. I think that's one. And the second one is, who is looking out for your supply chain? So whether that for you is third-party risk management, or you might call it something slightly in your organization, but that today is largely a giant black box that most CISOs don't have any insights into. I would say that's a critical role to have, is a GRC leader and a third-party risk management or supply chain, software supply chain leader.
Excellent. We are at the end of our hour. I want to pass it. Daniel, any last words that you want the audience to walk away with today?
No, I think I would echo Saša's last point. And I would emphasize that you need somebody who understands where all that risk is going. And so I think that really strong GRC team is a good place for that.
Great. And Saša, any final words?
No, I actually just want to thank Daniel for his time. Always insightful, and like he predicted this stuff back in 2016, 17, 18, and wrote about. Now I'm going to go back and read what he's writing about now, so I can know what the future holds.
Yeah, absolutely. We really do appreciate it. Daniel, speaking of which, where can the people find you? Where can they connect with Unsupervised Learning?
It's danielmiessler.com. Yeah, that's where I'm normally writing.
Excellent. So are you on any of the socials, or are you avoiding that like the plague?
Yeah, I'm on X, formerly Twitter. It's just Daniel Miessler.
Excellent. Well, we appreciate it. Now, for those of you that want to hear more from us, Saša and I did a fun webinar, more conversation actually about our takeaways on the Gartner report, which we will be sharing in this follow-up email. You get a recording of that, as well as ReversingLabs, our organization, put out our own report, the State of Software Supply Chain Security for 2020-2024. There's some big data points in there that are telling of the direction that the software supply chain-based attacks are going, and why you, as an member of your organization, should be concerned about the software you're introducing into your environment, or the software that you're shipping without visibility into it. So for now, I thank you, everyone, for joining us, staying with us for the full hour. Daniel, Saša, an absolute pleasure to be with you, be surrounded by such great ideas and big minds on this one. I hope everyone has a fantastic day, and be safe out there. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
See ya.